Hey there, welcome back to another journey through history's stranger corners. Tonight, we're diving into something that'll make you grateful for modern legal systems, no matter how frustrating they might seem. We're talking about the absolutely bizarre laws that governed ancient civilizations, the kind of rules that would make a parking ticket look reasonable. Before we begin, I'd love to know where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. There's something oddly comforting about knowing we're all here together, marveling at humanity's capacity for creating wonderfully weird rules. And if you enjoy these deep dives into history's more peculiar moments, consider subscribing. We've got plenty more strange stories where this came from. Now settle in, and let's explore some laws so bizarre, so utterly nonsensical, that you'll wonder how these civilizations managed to function at all. Let's start with ancient Babylon, where Hammurabi's code wasn't just the world's first written legal system, it was also a masterclass in creative punishment. You've probably heard an eye for an eye, but that's just the tip of the iceberg. In Babylon, if you were a surgeon and your patient died during an operation, they didn't just revoke your medical license. No, they cut off your hands, permanently, with a knife, while you were still very much alive and probably wishing you'd chosen accounting instead. But it gets stranger. If you were a builder and your house collapsed, killing the homeowner, you were executed. Fair enough, you might think. Shoddy construction should have consequences. But here's where it gets truly twisted. If the homeowner's son died in the collapse, they killed your son instead. Not you. Your child. Because apparently, the Babylonians believed in a very literal interpretation of proportional response. And if you were caught stealing sheep, well, you had to pay back 10 sheep, which sounds reasonable until you realize that most people who were stealing sheep probably couldn't afford 1 sheep, let alone 10, so you'd end up in debt slavery, working for years to pay off livestock. You ate in a moment of desperation. It was like ancient credit card debt, but with more sheep and significantly worse consequences for defaulting. The Babylonians also had very specific ideas about marriage. If a woman was accused of adultery but there was no proof, she had to jump into the Euphrates River. If she drowned, she was clearly guilty and the gods had punished her. If she survived, she was innocent, and her accuser had to pay her husband a fine. It was trial by ordeal with a theological twist, where the river itself was judge, jury, and sometimes executioner. But let's move on to ancient Egypt, where the legal system was even more creative in its approach to justice. The Egyptians believed that lying in court was such a serious offense that proven perjurers had their noses cut off. Not their tongues, which you might expect for lying, but their noses. The logic was that a person without a nose would be easily recognizable as someone who couldn't be trusted. They were essentially walking advertisements for dishonesty. Egyptian tomb robbing carried the death penalty, which makes sense given how seriously they took the afterlife. But the method of execution was particularly grim. Impalement. They would drive a wooden stake through your body and leave you there as a warning to other potential grave robbers. And just to make sure the message was clear, they'd often execute your entire family as well. Because in ancient Egypt, crime was apparently hereditary. The Egyptians also had laws about cats that would make modern cat owners weep with joy. Killing a cat, even accidentally, was punishable by death. Cats were sacred to the goddess Bastet, and harming one was considered a direct insult to the divine. There are records of Roman soldiers being killed by angry Egyptian mobs for accidentally killing cats. Imagine explaining that to your commanding officer. Sorry, sir, the mission failed because Jenkins stepped on a kitten. But perhaps the strangest Egyptian law concerned beards. Pharaohs were required to wear false beards as symbols of divine authority, even the female pharaohs. But common people were forbidden from growing real beards without special permission. So you had a society where the most powerful people wore fake facial hair, while everyone else had to stay clean-shaven by law. It was like ancient Egypt's version of a dress code, except violating it could get you beaten with sticks. Now let's sail across the Mediterranean to ancient Athens, birthplace of democracy and home to some truly baffling legal concepts. The Athenians invented something called ostracism, which sounds like a medical condition but was actually a political process. Once a year, citizens could vote to exile someone from the city for 10 years, not because they'd committed a crime, but simply because they were too popular or influential. Imagine that happening today. Sorry, you're too successful, too charismatic, too good at your job. Please leave the country for a decade. The person being ostracized didn't lose their property or citizenship. They just had to go away until people forgot why they were annoying. It was democracy's way of dealing with tall poppy syndrome, except instead of cutting you down, they just shipped you off to live somewhere else. The Athenians also had a law that required all citizens to take sides during political conflicts. Neutrality was illegal. If the city was split over an issue, you had to pick a faction and stick with it. The punishment for remaining neutral was exile, because apparently sitting on the fence was considered more dangerous than civil war. It's like being forced to choose between Coke and Pepsi, except your choice could determine whether you got to keep living in your hometown. And then there were the Athenian laws about public speaking. If you proposed a law that was later deemed harmful to the state, you could be prosecuted and executed, even if the law had been passed democratically. So you could convince the majority of your fellow citizens to support your idea, have it become law, and then be killed for it when people changed their minds. It was democracy with a very sharp edge, where the right to free speech came with potentially fatal consequences. But let's move north to Sparta, where the laws were less about justice and more about creating the most militaristic society possible. Spartan law required all male citizens to eat together in communal dining halls called syssitia. You couldn't eat at home with your family. You couldn't grab takeout. You couldn't even bring your own food. Everyone ate the same terrible black broth made from pork, blood, and vinegar. And if you couldn't afford to contribute to these communal meals, you lost your citizenship. The Spartans also had laws about marriage that would make modern dating apps look normal. Men were required to marry, but they couldn't live with their wives until they were 30. Instead, they had to sneak into their wives' bedrooms at night and leave before dawn. Getting caught spending the night with your own wife was considered a serious breach of discipline. Imagine explaining to your neighbors that you got arrested for sleeping in your own bed. Spartan law also mandated that all newborn children be examined by a council of elders. If the baby was deemed too weak or sickly, it was left on a mountainside to die. This wasn't considered murder. It was considered quality control. The Spartans believed that only the strongest should survive to become warriors, so they eliminated anyone who might not make the cut. It was eugenics with a military twist, where your fitness was determined in your first few days of life. And if you were a Spartan woman, you were required by law to exercise regularly and stay in peak physical condition, because strong mothers produce strong warriors. But you also had to exercise naked in public alongside the men. The Spartans believed that shame about the human body was a weakness, so they eliminated privacy as a legal concept. It was ancient CrossFit, except it was mandatory and there was no gym membership fee. Let's head over to ancient Rome, where the legal system was simultaneously sophisticated and completely insane. Roman law gave fathers absolute power over their families through something called patria potestas. A Roman father could legally kill his children at any age, sell them into slavery, or disown them for any reason. Adult sons with their own families still needed their father's permission to make major decisions. Some men didn't gain legal independence until their fathers died, which could be when they were 60 years old. The Romans also had laws about debt that make modern bankruptcy look merciful. If you couldn't pay what you owed, your creditor could literally own you. They could chain you up, force you to work, and even kill you if they wanted. The law specified that if you had multiple creditors, they could divide your body among them proportionally. So if you owed one person twice as much as another, they got twice as much of your corpse. It was accounting taken to its logical, gruesome conclusion. Roman marriage law was equally bizarre. A man could divorce his wife simply by telling her to leave and take her belongings with her. No paperwork, no court proceedings, no division of assets, just pack your things and go. But women couldn't divorce their husbands under any circumstances. Well, almost any circumstances. If a husband was caught in flagrante delicto with another man, the wife could divorce him. Not for adultery with a woman, mind you, only with a man. Roman law was apparently fine with heterosexual infidelity, but drew the line at homosexual affairs. The Romans also had sumptuary laws that regulated what people could wear, eat, and own based on their social class. Purple clothing was restricted to the emperor and his family. If you were caught wearing purple without permission, you could be executed for treason. The same went for silk, certain types of jewelry, and even specific hairstyles. Imagine being arrested because your toga was the wrong color, or because your haircut was too fancy for your tax bracket. But perhaps the strangest Roman law concerned gladiators. While we think of them as slaves forced to fight, many gladiators were actually free citizens who chose the profession. But once you became a gladiator, you lost most of your legal rights. You couldn't marry, own property, or make a will. You were legally dead while still being physically alive. It was like joining a very violent monastery where the vows included potential actual death rather than just spiritual death. Now let's venture into ancient China, where the legal system was built around the concept of the mandate of heaven. Chinese law held that the emperor ruled with divine approval, so any crime against the state was also a crime against heaven itself. This led to some truly creative punishments. For minor crimes, you might just be beaten with bamboo sticks. For more serious offences, you could be exiled to the frontier, where you'd probably die of exposure or be killed by nomadic raiders. But for the worst crimes, the Chinese invented something called the 9 familial exterminations. If you committed treason or rebellion, they didn't just execute you. They killed your parents, grandparents, children, grandchildren, siblings, cousins, aunts, uncles, and anyone else related to you by blood or marriage. The idea was to eliminate your bloodline entirely, ensuring that no one could carry on your rebellious legacy. It was genetic punishment taken to its absolute extreme. Chinese law also had very specific rules about who could use which roads. The emperor had his own highways that no one else was allowed to travel on. Lower-ranking officials had their designated paths, and commoners had to stick to the worst routes. If you were caught using a road above your station, you could be beaten, fined, or executed, depending on how far above your status you'd travelled. It was like having a caste system for transportation, where your social rank determined not just where you could go, but how you could get there. The Chinese also had laws about facial hair that make the Egyptian beard regulations look reasonable. During certain dynasties, the length and style of your mustache was regulated by law according to your profession and social status. Scholars had to wear their facial hair differently than merchants, who were different from farmers, who were different from soldiers. There were actually government officials whose job was to inspect people's mustaches and ensure they conformed to legal requirements. But let's travel to ancient India, where the legal system was codified in texts like the laws of Manu, which created one of the most rigid social hierarchies in human history. The caste system wasn't just social convention, it was enshrined in law. If you were born a Shudra, the lowest caste, and you dared to listen to the Vedas being recited, the punishment was to have molten lead poured into your ears, If you tried to recite them yourself, your tongue was cut out. Indian law also specified that if a lower caste person struck someone of a higher caste, they would lose the body part they used to commit the offense. Hit someone with your hand, lose your hand. Kick someone, lose your foot. The severity increased based on the caste difference. A Shudra who struck a Brahmin would be executed, but a Brahmin who killed a Shudra only had to perform religious penance, like they'd accidentally stepped on an insect. The laws of Manu also regulated marriage in ways that would make modern wedding planners weep. A woman could only marry within her caste, or to someone of a higher caste, but men could marry women from lower castes under specific circumstances. However, if a high caste woman married a low caste man, both families lost their caste status permanently. It was social mobility in reverse, where one bad marriage decision could doom your descendants for generations. Ancient Indian law also had bizarre regulations about food. What you could eat depended not just on your caste, but on your profession, the day of the week, the phase of the moon, and whether any religious festivals were happening. Some foods were forbidden during certain seasons, others during specific hours of the day. Breaking these dietary laws could result in losing your caste status, which was essentially social death in ancient Indian society. Let's head north to ancient Germanic tribes, where the legal system was based on something called weregild, or man price. Every person had a specific monetary value based on their social status, and if you killed someone, you had to pay their family that amount. A nobleman might be worth 600 gold pieces, while a peasant was only worth 100. It was like having a price tag on everyone's life, and murder became a financial transaction rather than a criminal act. But the Germanic tribes also had trial by combat, where legal disputes were settled by having the opposing parties fight each other. The theory was that the gods would ensure the righteous party won. If you were too old, sick, or weak to fight, you could hire a champion to fight for you. This meant that justice literally went to the strongest, or at least to whoever could afford the best warrior. The Germanic legal system also included trial by ordeal, where accused criminals had to undergo dangerous tests to prove their innocence. You might have to walk across red-hot coals, stick your hand in boiling water, or carry a red-hot iron bar. If you were injured, you were guilty. If you emerged unscathed, the gods had protected you because you were innocent. It was justice by miracle, where your legal fate depended on your pain tolerance and possibly divine intervention. These ancient legal systems reveal something fascinating about human nature. Our endless creativity in finding ways to organize society, even when those ways seem completely insane by modern standards. Every civilization believed their laws were reasonable, necessary, and divinely inspired. They solved real problems, even if their solutions created new problems that seem worse to us now. What's remarkable is that people lived under these systems for centuries, adapting their behavior to rules that would seem impossible to follow today. They found ways to navigate laws that regulated everything from their facial hair to their dinner menus, from their marriage partners to their mode of transportation. These weren't primitive people making primitive laws. Many of these civilizations produced incredible art, literature, philosophy, and technology. They built monuments that still inspire awe, developed mathematical concepts we still use, and created political ideas that influenced modern democracy. But their legal systems remind us that intelligence and wisdom don't always go hand in hand, and that what seems perfectly logical in one time and place can seem utterly bizarre in another. So the next time you're frustrated with modern bureaucracy, remember the ancient Spartan who got in trouble for eating dinner at home, or the Roman who was executed for wearing the wrong color toga, or the Chinese official who had to inspect mustaches for legal compliance. Our legal systems may be imperfect, but at least they don't require you to jump into a river to prove your innocence, or regulate the length of your facial hair based on your job description. Sweet dreams. and be grateful you live in an era where the law is mostly concerned with things like taxes and traffic violations rather than the divine significance of your beard style. But if you thought Mesopotamia and Egypt had peculiar legal systems, wait until you hear about what was happening in ancient China. The Celestial Empire, as it called itself, operated under the revolutionary concept of the mandate of heaven. Essentially, the emperor was divinely appointed to rule, and his laws weren't just legal codes, they were cosmic commands. Break them, and you weren't just committing a crime against society, you were literally disrupting the harmony of the universe. The Chinese took this philosophy and ran with it in some truly spectacular directions. During the Qin dynasty, around 220 BCE, Emperor Qin Shi Huang didn't just want to unify the country's currency and writing system. He wanted to control how people thought. So he implemented what might be the most extreme censorship law in human history. He ordered the burning of all books except those on medicine, agriculture, and divination. Possession of forbidden books wasn't just illegal, it was punishable by death. But here's where it gets really wild. If you were caught with banned literature, not only would you be executed, but your entire family would be buried alive with you. Yes, buried alive. The Chinese believed that intellectual rebellion was so dangerous, it could contaminate bloodlines. Speaking of family punishment, the Chinese perfected what they called extermination of the 9 familial relations. This wasn't just executing a criminal. This was wiping out their parents, grandparents, children, grandchildren, siblings, aunts, uncles, and in-laws. Imagine getting a parking ticket today and having your entire extended family tree eliminated as a result. The logic was that criminal tendencies were hereditary, so the only way to truly eliminate crime was to eliminate the criminal's entire genetic and social network. But perhaps nothing demonstrates ancient China's obsession with social hierarchy like their sumptuary laws, rules about who could wear what, eat what, and even walk where. During the Ming Dynasty, these regulations reached absolutely insane levels of specificity. The color yellow was reserved exclusively for the emperor. Not just any yellow. We're talking about specific shades. If you were caught wearing the wrong shade of yellow, you could be executed for impersonating imperial authority. The Chinese also had laws governing how many courses you could eat at dinner based on your social rank. Peasants were limited to 2 dishes per meal, while high-ranking officials could have up to 9. But here's the kicker. If you were a peasant who somehow managed to afford more food, eating it was still illegal. The law wasn't about protecting people from poverty, it was about maintaining cosmic order. Your stomach was apparently a threat to the universe. Even walking became a legal minefield. There were specific roads for different social classes, and using the wrong road was a criminal offense. The emperor had his own special yellow road that only he could use. High officials had their designated paths, merchants had theirs. Peasants had to stick to the muddy side routes. GPS would have been a legal nightmare in ancient China. One wrong turn, and you're committing treason. But the Chinese saved their most bizarre regulations for facial hair. Yes, facial hair. During certain dynasties, the style of your beard could determine your legal status. Scholars were required to have long, flowing beards to demonstrate their wisdom. Military officials had to keep their facial hair trimmed in specific geometric patterns. Merchants weren't allowed to have beards at all. Apparently, whiskers interfered with honest commerce. The government actually employed beard inspectors whose job was to patrol the streets and examine people's facial hair for legal compliance. And if you think that's strange, consider the ancient Chinese law regarding the proper way to sneeze. During the Tang dynasty, there were official regulations about sneezing etiquette based on your social status and the presence of authority figures. Peasants were required to sneeze quietly and cover their faces. Officials had to sneeze in a dignified manner that demonstrated their cultivation. But if you sneezed in the presence of the emperor, you had to perform a specific ritual afterward to cleanse yourself of the spiritual contamination caused by involuntary bodily functions. Failing to perform the post-sneeze purification ceremony could result in banishment. The legal system even regulated emotions. Public expressions of grief were strictly controlled. You could only mourn for specific periods based on your relationship to the deceased and your social rank. Crying too long for a distant relative was considered disrespectful to more important relationships. But crying too little for a close family member was seen as evidence of moral corruption. Court officials actually monitored funerals to ensure people were displaying the correct amount of sorrow. Meanwhile, in ancient India, the caste system created legal distinctions so complex they make modern tax codes look simple. The laws of Manu, compiled around 200 BCE, didn't just segregate society, they created parallel legal universes where the same action could be perfectly legal for one person and punishable by death for another, depending entirely on the circumstances of their birth. Consider this. If a Brahmin, a member of the priest caste, killed a Sudra, a member of the labourer caste, the legal penalty was the same as killing a dog. But if a Sudra killed a Brahmin, even in self-defense, the punishment was slow torture followed by death, and the Sudra's family would be enslaved for 7 generations. This wasn't just inequality before the law, this was the law explicitly stating that some human lives were worth less than others. The caste laws extended to the most intimate aspects of daily life. Marriage between castes wasn't just forbidden, it was cosmically dangerous. A Brahmin woman who married a Sudra man would lose her caste status and be treated as an untouchable. Her children would be considered pollution incarnate, barred from temples, wells, and most forms of employment. But here's where it gets really twisted. The law specified that such children could only be purified through a process involving ritual suicide. Yes, the legal system literally prescribed death as a solution to being born to the wrong parents. Food laws were equally insane. Each caste had specific dietary restrictions that weren't just about what you could eat, but who could prepare it, who could serve it, and even who could be present while you ate. A Brahmin couldn't consume food that had been looked at by a member of a lower caste. This created a whole professional class of food tasters whose job was to ensure that meals remained spiritually pure throughout the preparation process. Even more bizarre were the laws governing shadows. Yes, shadows. If the shadow of an untouchable fell across a Brahmin's food, the food became polluted and had to be destroyed. This led to complex regulations about the timing of food preparation, the positioning of kitchens, and even the height of buildings to prevent shadow contamination. Urban planning in ancient India had to account for the legal implications of shade. But perhaps the most mind-bending aspect of ancient Indian law was the concept of karmic justice. The legal system operated on the belief that crimes created spiritual pollution that would affect not just the criminal, but their entire community across multiple lifetimes. This meant that punishment wasn't just about deterrence or retribution, it was about cosmic cleansing. For serious crimes, the prescribed punishments were designed to burn off bad karma through suffering. A thief might have his hands cut off, but that was just the beginning. He would then be required to spend years performing ritual purification, during which his family would have to support him while he was unable to work. The economic devastation was intentional. The law was designed to make crime so costly that entire communities would police themselves to prevent karmic contamination. The Germanic tribes of Northern Europe took a completely different approach to justice, one that makes modern plea bargaining look sophisticated. They operated under a system called Weregild, literally man price, where every person had a specific monetary value and most crimes could be resolved by paying the appropriate compensation. This sounds reasonable until you realize how the pricing worked. A noble's life was worth 600 shillings. A freeman was worth 200 shillings. A slave was worth about the same as a good horse. But the system got really weird when it came to partial injuries. There were official price lists for every conceivable type of bodily harm. Losing an eye cost the attacker 50 shillings. A finger was worth 10 shillings, but the thumb was 20 because it was more useful. Knocking out a front tooth cost more than a back tooth because it was more visible. The Germanic legal codes even specified prices for emotional damages. Insulting someone's mother cost 5 shillings. Calling someone a coward cost 3 shillings, but calling someone a liar cost 12 shillings because it damaged their ability to testify in legal proceedings. Slander wasn't just rude, it was economically quantifiable. But the Germanic tribes saved their most creative legal solutions for cases where payment wasn't possible or wasn't accepted. They invented trial by combat, but not just for warriors. Anyone could be required to fight for their legal rights, including women, children, and elderly people. If you couldn't fight yourself, you could hire a champion, leading to the world's first professional legal fighters, lawyers who solved disputes with swords instead of arguments. Even more bizarre was trial by ordeal. If you were accused of a crime and couldn't prove your innocence through combat or payment, you might be subjected to various tests that supposedly revealed divine judgment. Trial by hot iron required the accused to carry a red-hot iron bar for a specific distance. If the burns healed cleanly within 3 days, you were innocent. If they became infected, you were guilty and faced additional punishment. Trial by water came in 2 varieties, hot and cold. Trial by hot water required you to retrieve an object from a cauldron of boiling water. Trial by cold water involved being bound and thrown into a river. If you floated, you were guilty because the pure water rejected you. If you sank, you were innocent, though possibly drowned. This created the perverse situation where surviving the ordeal was evidence of guilt. The logic behind these trials reveals something fascinating about how these societies understood justice. They believed that the gods were actively involved in legal proceedings and that divine will would manifest through physical trials. This wasn't primitive superstition. It was a sophisticated theological legal system based on the belief that ultimate justice came from divine intervention rather than human judgment. What's truly remarkable about all these ancient legal systems is how they reflected each society's deepest beliefs about human nature, divine will, and social order. The Babylonians believed justice required perfect reciprocity. The Egyptians thought law should maintain cosmic balance. The Chinese saw legal compliance as essential to universal harmony. The Indians viewed justice as karmic purification. The Germanic tribes trusted divine intervention over human judgment. These weren't just random rules imposed by tyrants. They were comprehensive worldviews translated into legal codes. Every strange law, every bizarre punishment, every seemingly arbitrary regulation was part of a larger system designed to create the kind of society these civilizations believed the gods wanted. And here's what's really mind-blowing. These systems worked, not perfectly, not fairly by our standards, but they created stable societies that lasted for centuries or even millennia. The Code of Hammurabi influenced legal thinking for over 1,000 years. Chinese legal philosophy shaped East Asian jurisprudence for 2 millennia. Indian caste law survived British colonialism and still influences modern India. Germanic legal concepts evolved into the common law systems used throughout the English-speaking world today. These ancient lawmakers weren't crazy. They were dealing with the same fundamental challenges we face today. How do you create order without destroying freedom? How do you balance individual rights with collective needs? How do you make justice both effective and legitimate? Their solutions might seem bizarre to us, but they were logical responses to the specific circumstances and beliefs of their time. Human legal ingenuity. Human beings, it turns out, are incredibly creative when it comes to making rules. These ancient civilizations invented legal concepts we still use today. Contracts, property rights, criminal versus civil law, appeals processes, legal representation, and evidence-based judgment. They also invented legal concepts we've thankfully abandoned: trial by combat, collective punishment, caste-based justice, and divine ordeal. But perhaps most importantly, they demonstrated that law is never just about rules, it's about values. Every legal system reflects what a society considers sacred, what it fears, what it hopes to achieve, and what it's willing to sacrifice to get there. The strangest laws of ancient times weren't aberrations, they were windows into completely different ways of understanding justice, authority, and human nature. So the next time you're frustrated with modern bureaucracy or confused by contemporary legal complexity, remember that we're part of a long tradition of human beings trying to figure out how to live together peacefully. We've made progress. Nobody's getting buried alive for owning the wrong books anymore. But we're still working on the same fundamental challenges our ancestors faced thousands of years ago. The only difference is that now we debate these issues in courtrooms and legislatures instead of settling them with hot iron and trial by combat. Though sometimes, watching modern political debates, you have to wonder if we've really come that far after all. Part 12. The Final Nightmare. Love in the Shadow of Death. As we reach the end of our journey through the nightmare of medieval romance, we must confront perhaps the most heartbreaking reality of all, that even when love somehow managed to bloom in this hostile world, it was almost always cut short by death itself. For in medieval times, love was not just dangerous because of social constraints or religious persecution. It was dangerous because life itself was so desperately, tragically brief. Picture, if you will, a young couple who had somehow beaten the odds. Perhaps they were peasants whose families had allowed them to marry for affection rather than necessity. Perhaps they were nobles who had found genuine companionship within an arranged marriage. Perhaps they were merchants who had chosen each other freely, blessed with enough wealth to make their own decisions. Against all expectations, against all the forces we've explored throughout this series, they had found love. But even then, even for these fortunate few, medieval life offered no guarantees. The woman might die in childbirth, a fate that claimed so many mothers that it was considered almost inevitable. The man might be conscripted into his lord's army and never return from some distant battlefield. Plague could sweep through their village in a matter of days, leaving behind only empty houses and broken hearts. A simple infection from a minor wound could turn fatal within hours, transforming a loving spouse into a grieving widow. The average life expectancy in medieval Europe hovered around 30 to 40 years, and those numbers were dragged down by the staggering infant mortality rates. But even if you survived childhood, even if you made it to adulthood and found love, you were still racing against time. Most romantic relationships lasted not decades but years, sometimes only months before death intervened. Consider the psychological toll of living with such uncertainty. How do you open your heart fully to someone when you know that tomorrow they might be gone forever? How do you plan for a future when the present is so precarious? Medieval people lived with a constant awareness of mortality that we can barely comprehend today. Every goodbye might be the last one. Every argument might remain forever unresolved. Every moment of happiness was shadowed by the knowledge that it could vanish at any instant. The literature of the period reflects this reality in its obsession with tragic love stories. The tales of Tristan and Isolde, of Lancelot and Guinevere, of countless unnamed lovers separated by death or duty, these weren't just entertainment. They were mirrors reflecting the lived experience of a society where love and loss were inextricably intertwined. But perhaps most cruel of all was how medieval society itself seemed designed to prevent people from even experiencing love before death claimed them. The elaborate courtship rituals, the requirement for family approval, the economic negotiations that preceded marriage, all of these created delays that many couples simply didn't survive. Young people might spend years seeking permission to marry, only to have one partner die before the wedding could take place. The church's insistence on complex marriage procedures made things even worse. Bans had to be published weeks in advance, giving families time to object. Dowries had to be negotiated and transferred. Religious ceremonies had to be performed at specific times of year when the church calendar permitted. All of these requirements meant that even couples who had found love and received approval might wait months or even years before they could actually be together. And during those waiting periods, death stalked constantly. War could erupt without warning, sweeping young men away to distant battlefields. Epidemics could race through communities faster than wedding plans could be completed. Accidents, violence, and disease turned every delay into a potential tragedy. The records that survive from medieval times are filled with heartbreaking stories of love, interrupted by death. Letters that end mid-sentence because the writer succumbed to fever. Marriage contracts signed by people who died before the wedding day. Poems written by grieving lovers who outlived their partners by only weeks or months themselves. Even the rare couples who managed to marry and survive the early years of their relationship faced the constant threat of separation. Medieval warfare was not conducted by professional armies, but by feudal levies. Ordinary men pulled from their homes and families to fight in their lord's conflicts. A farmer might kiss his wife goodbye in the morning and march off to war that same afternoon, never to return. Women faced their own deadly risks. Pregnancy was essentially a death sentence that you might survive, with maternal mortality rates that would be considered catastrophic by modern standards. And since effective contraception didn't exist, married women faced this risk repeatedly throughout their fertile years. Many women who survived their first childbirth died during their second, third, or fourth. The constant presence of death created a peculiar intensity to medieval romantic relationships. When you know that your time together might be measured in months rather than years, every moment becomes precious. Love letters from the period have a desperate quality, an urgent need to express everything while there's still time. People didn't have the luxury of taking their relationships for granted because they knew how quickly everything could change. This awareness of mortality also shaped medieval marriage customs in ways that might seem strange to us today. The practice of quickly remarrying after the death of a spouse wasn't just about economic necessity, though that was certainly part of it. It was also about the recognition that life was too short to spend it alone, and that if you were fortunate enough to find love again, you needed to seize it immediately. The religious framework of medieval Christianity offered some comfort in the face of this constant loss, but it was cold comfort at best. The church taught that earthly love was temporary and that true happiness could only be found in the afterlife. This doctrine meant that grieving lovers were often told that their pain was a sign of spiritual weakness, that they should rejoice in their partner's death as a release from earthly suffering. The economic realities of medieval life made the impact of death even more devastating. When a husband died, his widow might lose not just her companion, but her entire means of survival. When a wife died, the husband lost not just his partner, but the person who managed his household, raised his children, and often contributed significantly to the family's income through her own labor. Children, too, were constant reminders of mortality. With infant mortality rates approaching 50% in some regions, parents learned not to become too attached to their babies until they had survived their first few years. The death of children was so common that many families didn't even name their babies until they were several months old. Imagine the psychological impact of living in a world where loving your own children too much was considered dangerous because it set you up for inevitable heartbreak. The seasonal rhythms of medieval life added another layer of tragedy to romantic relationships. Winter was a time of particular danger when food ran low, fuel was scarce, and diseases spread rapidly through crowded, poorly ventilated homes. Many couples who survived the relatively healthy months of spring and summer found themselves separated by death during the harsh winter months. Even the physical spaces where medieval people lived seemed designed to remind them of mortality. Churches dominated the landscape, their graveyards filled with the remains of those who had died young. Homes were built close to these cemeteries so that the living were constantly surrounded by reminders of death. Wedding ceremonies often took place in the same churches where funeral masses were held, sometimes on the same day. The artistic and literary culture of medieval Europe reflected this omnipresence of death in romantic relationships. Songs and poems about love almost invariably ended in tragedy. Visual art depicted couples being separated by death, with skeletons and symbols of mortality woven into even the most romantic scenes. The famous Danse macabre, or Dance of Death, which appeared in art throughout medieval Europe, showed death as a figure who danced with people of all ages and social classes, taking lovers from each other's arms without warning or mercy. But perhaps most heartbreaking of all was how this constant threat of death affected the way medieval people approached love itself. Many learned to guard their hearts, to avoid becoming too attached, to maintain emotional distance as a form of protection. Others went the opposite direction, throwing themselves into passionate relationships with a desperate intensity born of the knowledge that time was running out. The few medical texts that survive from the medieval period reveal how little was understood about the diseases that claimed so many young lives. Physicians had no understanding of infection, no effective treatments for most illnesses, and no ability to predict or prevent the epidemics that could wipe out entire communities. When someone fell ill, their loved ones could only watch helplessly as they died, often in agony, with no real hope of recovery. The legal systems of medieval Europe made the impact of sudden death even more devastating for surviving partners. Women had few legal rights and could lose their homes, their children, and their means of support when their husbands died. Men who lost their wives often found themselves unable to care for their children or manage their households, forcing them to remarry quickly out of necessity rather than love. Travel, which we take for granted today, was incredibly dangerous in medieval times. A merchant travelling to the next town might be killed by bandits, a pilgrim might die of disease on the road, a messenger might never reach his destination. This meant that couples were often separated for months at a time, never knowing whether their partner was alive or dead. Many people lived their entire lives without travelling more than a few miles from their birthplace, not out of lack of curiosity, but out of the very real knowledge that leaving home might mean never returning. The impact of constant warfare on romantic relationships cannot be overstated. Medieval Europe was almost constantly at war, between kingdoms, between nobles, between cities, between religious factions. These conflicts pulled men away from their families and lovers, often for years at a time. Many women spent their entire married lives as essentially single mothers, raising children whose fathers they rarely saw and might never see again. Even in times of peace, violence was a constant threat. Domestic disputes could quickly escalate to deadly feuds. Accusations of witchcraft or heresy could lead to execution. Simple accidents, a fall from a horse, a cut that became infected, a fire that spread too quickly, could kill in an instant. Medieval people lived with the knowledge that death could come at any moment, from any direction, without warning. The record-keeping of medieval times, such as it was, tells us that most people died without last words, without final declarations of love, without the chance to say goodbye to their partners. Death in medieval times was often sudden, brutal, and lonely. The romantic ideal of dying peacefully in your lover's arms was a fantasy that few ever experienced. And yet, despite all of this, despite the constant threat of death, despite the social obstacles, despite the religious persecution, despite the economic pressures, love persisted. People continued to fall in love, to hope for happiness, to believe that somehow their story might be different. They wrote letters they knew might never be delivered, made promises they knew they might not live to keep, and opened their hearts despite knowing how easily they could be broken. In the end, perhaps that's the most remarkable thing about medieval romance. Not that it was a nightmare, but that it existed at all in the face of such overwhelming odds. The courage it took to love someone in medieval times, knowing that death could separate you at any moment, was perhaps greater than any heroism celebrated in the songs of knights and battles. As our journey through the nightmare of medieval dating comes to a close, we're left with a profound appreciation for how far we've come. The freedoms we take for granted, the ability to choose our own partners, to marry for love, to expect to live long enough to grow old together, were luxuries beyond the imagination of our medieval ancestors. When we complain about the complexities of modern romance, when we feel frustrated by dating apps or worried about finding the right person, we might remember Margaret, trembling at her wedding to a man she feared, or Isabella, trapped in a loveless political marriage, or the countless unnamed lovers whose stories ended not in happiness, but in the simple, brutal fact of death. Their love existed in the shadow of mortality, constrained by forces beyond their control, threatened by dangers we can barely imagine. Yet they loved anyway. They hoped anyway. They believed, against all evidence, that somehow love could triumph over the nightmare of their world. And in that hope, in that persistence, in that refusal to surrender to despair, despite overwhelming odds, we see something that transcends the particular horrors of medieval life. We see the indomitable human capacity for love, for connection, for the belief that even in the darkest times, even when death stalks every moment, the heart can still find reasons to hope. The nightmare of medieval dating was real, and it was terrible. But it was not the end of the story. Love survived. Hope endured. And eventually, slowly, painfully, the world changed. The freedoms we enjoy today were built on the sacrifices of those who came before us, who loved and loved again in times when such courage seemed almost impossible. So tonight, as you drift off to sleep, safe in your own bed, free to love whom you choose, perhaps spare a thought for those long-ago lovers who faced their nightmares with nothing but hope. They remind us that love, however constrained, however threatened, however brief, is always worth fighting for. The nightmare is over, the dawn has come, and love, as always, endures. Why dating was a nightmare in medieval times. Part 4. As dawn breaks over the medieval world we've been exploring, painting the sky in hues of amber and rose, we find ourselves standing at yet another crossroads of human misery. If you thought the physical dangers, social constraints, and supernatural terrors we've discussed were the full extent of medieval romantic nightmares, Prepare yourself for perhaps the most insidious enemy of all, the complete and utter absence of choice that defined every aspect of courtship and marriage. Picture, if you will, a young woman named Isabel, barely 14 summers old, standing in the draughty stone chamber of her father's modest manor house. The morning light filters through the single narrow window, casting long shadows across the rushes scattered on the floor. Her hands tremble not from the cold, but from the knowledge that today her entire future will be decided by men who view her as nothing more than a commodity to be traded. Her father, Sir Aldrich, paces before the small fire, his weathered face creased with the weight of financial desperation. The harvest has been poor for 3 consecutive years. The roof leaks, the serfs grow restless, and the neighbouring lord grows ever more aggressive about the unpaid debts that mount like storm clouds on the horizon. Isabel knows nothing of these adult concerns, but she understands with the terrible clarity of youth that her life is about to change forever. Sir Aldrich has received an offer for his daughter's hand, not from a young knight seeking love, not from a poet who has glimpsed her beauty at market, but from Lord Godfrey the Grim, a man of 43 winters who has already buried 2 wives under circumstances that the local gossips whisper about in hushed, fearful tones. Lord Godfrey owns vast lands, commands 100 men-at-arms, and most importantly, he can clear Sir Aldrich's debts with a casual wave of his jewelled hand. Isabel has never spoken to Lord Godfrey beyond a curtsy and a mumbled greeting at the harvest festival. She knows him only by reputation. His volatile temper, his fondness for ale that turns him violent, and the way his small, dark eyes seem to undress every woman they fall upon. The very thought of his hands on her body makes her stomach clench with revulsion. But her feelings, her fears, her desperate desire to flee into the forest and never return, none of this matters. Because in the medieval world, love was not a factor in marriage. It was not even a consideration. Marriage was a business transaction, a political alliance, a survival strategy. Romance, if it existed at all, was the dangerous luxury of troubadours and their songs, not something that practical people could afford to indulge. Sir Aldrich explains the arrangement to his daughter with the same tone he might use to discuss the sale of livestock. She will marry Lord Godfrey in a fortnight. The dowry has been negotiated, 3 silver marks, her mother's pearl necklace, and the promise of Isabel's complete obedience and fertility. Lord Godfrey has graciously agreed to assume Sir Aldrich's debts, ensuring that the family will not lose their lands or face the shame of destitution. Isabel opens her mouth to protest, to plead, to explain that she would rather take religious vows or throw herself from the castle walls than submit to such a fate. But the words die in her throat because she has been raised from birth to understand that her desires are irrelevant. She is a woman, and women exist to serve the needs of men and the demands of family honour. This complete absence of romantic agency was not unique to Isabel's fictional plight. It was the lived reality for virtually every woman in medieval Europe, from the humblest peasant girl to the daughters of kings. The concept of dating as we understand it, the gradual process of getting to know potential partners, of choosing whom to spend time with based on attraction and compatibility, simply did not exist. For peasant families, marriages were arranged based on practical considerations, combining resources, securing labour for farming, ensuring that elderly parents would have support in their twilight years. A young woman might find herself betrothed to her neighbour's son, not because they enjoyed each other's company, but because their families' lands were adjacent and could be more efficiently worked together. Among the merchant classes, marriages were business mergers disguised as romantic ceremonies. A cloth merchant's daughter would be wed to a spice trader's son, to create new trade partnerships and expand commercial networks. The bride and groom might meet for the first time at their wedding ceremony, expected to smile and exchange vows while inwardly calculating the profit margins of their union. But it was among the nobility that the absence of choice reached its most grotesque extremes. Royal and aristocratic marriages were diplomatic treaties written in human flesh. A princess might be promised in marriage to secure a military alliance, to end a war, or to prevent one from starting. Her personal feelings about her intended spouse were not merely ignored, they were actively dangerous, as any display of reluctance could be interpreted as treason against the realm's interests. Consider the fate of Princess Margaret of Norway, betrothed at the age of 3 to the future King Edward I of England. She never lived to see her wedding day, dying during the voyage to Scotland at the tender age of 7. But her tragic end illustrates how early medieval children were treated as political pawns, rather than human beings deserving of protection and nurturing. Even when marriages appear to offer some element of choice, closer examination reveals the illusion. The medieval practice of courtly love, that elaborate system of chivalric romance celebrated in troubadour songs, was specifically designed to channel romantic feelings away from marriage and into impossible, unconsummated relationships. A knight might spend years composing poetry for a married lady, performing brave deeds in her honour, and publicly declaring his undying devotion, precisely because such love could never be fulfilled. This wasn't accidental. Courtly love served as a safety valve for a society that had completely separated marriage from affection, by creating an elaborate fantasy of romantic devotion that was by definition impossible to achieve. Medieval culture allowed people to imagine what love might feel like, while ensuring that such dangerous emotions never interfered with the serious business of political and economic alliances. The psychological toll of this system was devastating. Chronicles from the period are filled with accounts of young women who fell into deep melancholy after learning of their betrothal to unwanted suitors. Some refused to eat, wasting away in what medieval physicians called green sickness, likely what we would now recognize as severe depression. Others attempted to flee to convents, seeking the only alternative to marriage that society deemed acceptable for women. But even religious life offered limited escape from male control. Entering a convent required a substantial dowry, often as much as a marriage would cost. The abbess was typically from a powerful noble family, and admission was granted based on political connections rather than spiritual calling. Once inside, nuns lived under strict rules that governed every aspect of their existence, from when they could speak to what they could eat. For men, the situation was different, but hardly better. While young men of noble birth had slightly more freedom to voice preferences about potential brides, they too were expected to marry for family advantage rather than personal inclination. A younger son might find himself pushed into the church whether he had a religious vocation or not, simply because there wasn't enough inheritance to support multiple marriages within the family. The economic realities underlying these arrangements were brutally simple. In a world without banking systems, insurance, or social safety nets, marriage was the primary mechanism for transferring wealth and ensuring survival. A failed harvest, a military defeat, or a noble's displeasure could destroy a family's fortunes overnight. Under such circumstances, romantic feelings were seen as dangerously destabilizing luxuries that practical people could not afford. This is why medieval literature is so often tragic. The greatest love stories of the era, Tristan and Isolde, Lancelot and Guinevere, Heloise and Abelard, are all tales of impossible love, relationships that could never be publicly acknowledged or safely consummated. These stories resonated precisely because they gave voice to the longings that real people had to suppress in their daily lives. The legal framework surrounding marriage reinforced these constraints at every level. Under medieval law, women were considered perpetual minors, passing from their father's authority to their husbands without ever achieving legal independence. A woman could not own property in her own name, could not make contracts, and could not appear in court without male representation. Marriage was literally a transfer of ownership, with the bride's father formally giving her away to the groom. The marriage ceremony itself reflected this property-based understanding of the relationship. The bride often had no speaking role in her own wedding, standing silent while men negotiated the terms of her transfer. The exchange of rings symbolized not mutual love, but the groom's claim on his new possession. The tradition of carrying the bride over the threshold originated from the Roman practice of symbolically abducting her from her father's house. Even the physical consummation of marriage was governed by property law rather than concepts of mutual consent. A husband had unlimited sexual access to his wife, and refusing him was grounds for severe punishment. The idea of marital rape did not exist in medieval legal thinking, because wives were considered to have given permanent consent when they spoke their wedding vows. For young people trapped in this system, the psychological adaptation required was enormous. They had to learn to find meaning and purpose in relationships they had not chosen, to build lives with partners they might barely know, and to accept that their deepest emotional needs would likely never be met. Some found ways to create genuine affection within arranged marriages, growing to care for each other through shared trials and mutual dependence. Others retreated into private worlds of imagination and fantasy, living rich interior lives while maintaining the facade of dutiful submission. The children born into these loveless unions faced their own challenges. They grew up in households where emotional distance between parents was normal, where expressions of affection were rare, and where the primary relationship models they observed were based on duty rather than genuine connection. This created a cycle of emotional deprivation that was passed down through generations, as each new cohort of children learned that love was something that happened in songs and stories, not in real life. Medical texts from the period reveal the physical toll this emotional suppression took on medieval people. Physicians wrote extensively about melancholia, hysteria, and other conditions that we might now recognize as depression and anxiety disorders. They prescribed bloodletting, herbal purges, and religious pilgrimages for ailments that were likely caused by the fundamental mismatch between human emotional needs and social requirements. The Church's teachings added another layer of complexity to this already difficult situation. Medieval Christianity held deeply conflicted views about sexuality and marriage. On one hand, marriage was considered a sacrament, blessed by God and necessary for the continuation of Christian society. On the other hand, sexual desire was viewed as inherently sinful, a consequence of humanity's fall from grace in the Garden of Eden. This created an impossible bind for married couples. They were expected to have sexual relations for the purpose of producing children, but they were also taught that taking pleasure in these relations was morally dangerous. Church authorities provided detailed guidelines about which sexual positions were acceptable, which days of the week were appropriate for marital relations, and how couples should feel about their physical intimacy. The overall message was clear. Even within marriage, sexuality was something to be endured rather than enjoyed. Women bore the brunt of this sexual shame more heavily than men. Medieval medical and religious texts portrayed female sexuality as particularly dangerous and difficult to control. Women who showed too much enthusiasm for physical intimacy were suspected of being influenced by demons or practicing witchcraft. The ideal wife was supposed to submit to her husband's desires without experiencing desires of her own. These attitudes created profound alienation between spouses, making emotional and physical intimacy even more difficult to achieve. Couples were expected to share beds and produce children while maintaining emotional distance from each other and suppressing their natural responses to physical pleasure. The psychological strain of this arrangement contributed to the high rates of mental illness documented in medieval medical texts. The seasonal rhythms of agricultural life added another layer of stress to medieval marriages. During planting and harvest seasons, couples might work 18-hour days with little time for conversation or connection. During the long winter months, they might be trapped together in small, cold spaces, with nothing to do but endure each other's company. These extreme fluctuations between forced separation and forced proximity made it difficult to develop the gradual intimacy that healthy relationships require. The constant presence of death in medieval life also shaped romantic relationships in profound ways. With average life expectancies hovering around 30 to 40 years, couples could expect their unions to be relatively brief. Many people experienced multiple marriages as spouses died from disease, childbirth complications, or violence. This created a psychological dynamic where emotional investment was always tempered by the knowledge that loss was inevitable and likely to come soon. Children learned early not to become too attached to their parents or siblings, as death could claim anyone at any time. This emotional guardedness carried over into adult relationships, making it even more difficult for couples to develop deep bonds with each other. The medieval tendency to arrange marriages quickly after a spouse's death, sometimes within weeks, reflected not callousness, but practical necessity in a world where survival often depended on having a partner. The absence of effective contraception meant that every act of sexual intimacy carried the possibility of pregnancy, and pregnancy carried significant risks of death for both mother and child. This created a cruel irony. The very acts that might have brought couples closer together were shadowed by the constant threat of loss. Many women spent their entire adult lives either pregnant, nursing, or recovering from childbirth, making it difficult to develop identities beyond their reproductive function. For men, the pressure to prove their masculinity through sexual conquest and the production of heirs created its own forms of psychological distress. Medieval concepts of honor were closely tied to sexual performance and the ability to control female family members. A man whose wife was unfaithful, whose daughters were seduced, or whose mother remarried could lose social standing and even face violence from other men seeking to defend their own honor. The economic uncertainty of medieval life added constant stress to all relationships. A bad harvest, a military defeat, or a change in political fortune could destroy a family's prospects overnight. Couples had to navigate not only their personal dynamics, but also the external pressures of survival in an unpredictable and often hostile world. Even successful marriages that managed to develop genuine affection faced constant threats from external forces. Political alliances could be disrupted by war. Economic partnerships could be destroyed by trade disputes, and personal relationships could be shattered by accusations of heresy or witchcraft. The medieval world offered no protection for relationships that were based purely on emotional connection rather than practical advantage. As we witness Isabel's story reaching its inevitable conclusion, her marriage to Lord Godfrey, her loss of independence, her transformation from a young woman with hopes and dreams into a piece of property to be managed and used, we must confront the sobering reality that her fate was shared by millions of women throughout the medieval period. The wedding ceremony takes place on a grey October morning, with rain drumming against the chapel windows, like the tears Isabel has learned not to shed. She stands beside a man who smells of ale and unwashed wool, speaking vows she does not mean to a future she cannot bear to contemplate. The assembled guests smile and offer congratulations, but their eyes hold the same resigned knowledge that shadows every medieval marriage. This is not about love, happiness, or human fulfillment. This is about survival, duty, and the maintenance of social order at any cost. And as the ceremony concludes and Isabel becomes Lady Godfrey, her girlhood name and identity legally erased, we are reminded that the nightmare of medieval dating was not just about the dangers couples faced, but about the complete absence of dating itself. In a world where choice was the privilege of the powerful and love was the luxury of the doomed, the simple human desire to choose one's own partner became an impossible dream. The medieval approach to romance created generations of people who learned to suppress their deepest longings, to accept loveless relationships as normal, and to find meaning in duty rather than connection. It established patterns of gender inequality and emotional repression that would echo through the centuries, shaping Western attitudes toward love and marriage long after the Middle Ages had ended. When we complain about the difficulties of modern dating, the awkwardness of online profiles, the challenge of finding compatible partners, the pain of romantic rejection, we should remember Isabel and the millions like her who never had the chance to experience these problems. Because having problems with dating, having choices that don't work out, having the freedom to make mistakes in love, these are privileges that our medieval ancestors could not even imagine. The nightmare of medieval dating was not that it was difficult or dangerous, though it was certainly both. The true nightmare was that for most people, it didn't exist at all. And in understanding this dark chapter of human history, we can better appreciate the precious freedoms we now possess. The right to choose our own partners, to marry for love rather than obligation, and to believe that happiness, not just survival, is a worthy goal for human relationships. Part 5 continues our exploration of the strangest laws in ancient times, examining the peculiar legal systems that governed medieval Europe during its darkest and most chaotic centuries. Medieval Europe represented perhaps the most bizarre and contradictory legal landscape in human history. As the Roman Empire crumbled and barbarian kingdoms rose from its ashes, law became a patchwork of Germanic tribal customs, Christian doctrine, and remnants of Roman jurisprudence. The result was a legal system so strange and often brutal that it would seem like dark fantasy if it weren't meticulously documented in surviving court records and legal codes. The Holy Roman Empire, that sprawling collection of kingdoms and duchies that dominated Central Europe, operated under what historians call the Saxon Mirror, a legal code that reads like something from a fever dream. Under these laws, if you were caught stealing bread, the punishment wasn't just losing a hand. The court would first determine whether you stole out of hunger or greed. If hunger, you might escape with public humiliation and a fine. If greed, they would cut off your right hand, but not before forcing you to eat a piece of the stolen bread while watching the executioner sharpen his blade. The psychological torture was considered as important as the physical punishment. Even more bizarre were the laws governing marriage and sexuality. In many Germanic kingdoms, adultery was punished not by death, but by a form of ritualized humiliation that could last for years. The guilty party would be forced to wear distinctive clothing, often bright yellow or red, and could only speak when spoken to. They were banned from all festivals and religious ceremonies, effectively becoming social ghosts in their own communities. Some regions required adulterers to crawl on their hands and knees to church every Sunday for 7 years, while the congregation threw mud and refuse at them. The church's influence on medieval law created some of the most absurd regulations in legal history. Canon law, which governed not just clergy but all Christians in matters of morality, included detailed provisions about everything from how often married couples could have intercourse to the proper way to sneeze during Mass. Having sexual relations with your spouse more than once per week was considered a sin, requiring confession and penance. Having relations during Lent, Advent, or any of the numerous feast days could result in excommunication. Perhaps strangest of all were the sumptuary laws, regulations that dictated what people could wear, eat, and even how they could decorate their homes based on their social class. In medieval France, only nobles could wear purple clothing, and the exact shade was legally defined. Merchants caught wearing the wrong colour. Purple could be fined, imprisoned, or in extreme cases, have their tongues pierced with hot irons. These laws extended to food as well. Peasants were forbidden from eating white bread, and only the nobility could consume certain spices. Black pepper was so restricted that possessing it without proper documentation was treated as theft from the crown. The legal treatment of animals in medieval Europe reveals just how alien this world was to modern sensibilities. Animals could be tried for crimes in formal court proceedings, complete with appointed lawyers and detailed legal arguments. In 1386, a pig in Falaise, France, was convicted of murdering a child and was sentenced to death by hanging. The pig was dressed in human clothing for the execution, and the entire town was required to attend as witnesses. The court records, which survive today, show that the pig was even appointed a defense attorney, who argued that the animal was merely following its nature, and therefore could not be held morally responsible for its actions. Even more bizarre were the trials of insects and vermin. When locusts destroyed crops or weevils infested grain stores, formal legal proceedings would be initiated against the offending creatures. The insects would be summoned to court through public proclamation, and when they inevitably failed to appear, they would be tried in absentia. These trials could last for months, with lawyers presenting elaborate arguments about whether animals had souls and could therefore be held responsible for their actions. The church often became involved, with priests performing exorcisms on the accused creatures. Medieval inheritance law created some of the most complicated and absurd situations in legal history. Under the system of primogeniture, the eldest son inherited everything, but the definitions of eldest and legitimate were subject to endless interpretation. Bastard children could inherit if they were born during certain phases of the moon, if their parents later married while standing in a specific location, or if they could prove their conception occurred during a religiously sanctioned festival. Some regions required illegitimate children to prove their worthiness through trial by combat, even if they were mere children themselves. The legal status of women in medieval Europe was so restricted, it's difficult to comprehend from a modern perspective. A woman could not own property, enter into contracts, or even testify in court without a male guardian's permission. But the specific restrictions varied wildly from region to region. In some Germanic kingdoms, women could not speak their own names in public without permission. In others, they were forbidden from wearing their hair uncovered, and violating this law could result in having their heads forcibly shaved by court officials. Perhaps most shocking were the marriage laws that allowed child brides as young as 7 years old. These weren't just arranged engagements. They were legally binding marriages that could be consummated when the girl reached 12. The legal code specified exactly how these marriages should be conducted, including the precise words that had to be spoken and the required witnesses. Failure to follow the proper procedures could result in the marriage being declared invalid, which could have devastating consequences for the families involved. Medieval criminal law operated on principles that seem completely alien today. The concept of intent was largely irrelevant. If someone died as a result of your actions, you were guilty of murder, regardless of whether you meant to kill them. If you accidentally bumped into someone who then fell and struck their head on a stone, you could be executed for murder. The only way to avoid this fate was through the various forms of trial by ordeal, which were essentially elaborate methods of torture designed to determine guilt or innocence through divine intervention. Trial by hot iron required the accused to carry a red-hot piece of metal for a specified distance. If their hands healed cleanly within 3 days, they were innocent. If the wounds became infected, they were guilty and would be executed. Trial by cold water involved throwing the accused into a river or pond while bound. If they sank, they were innocent, though often drowned. If they floated, they were guilty and would be burned alive. The logic was that water, being pure, would reject the guilty and accept the innocent. Even more bizarre was trial by combat, which could be demanded by either the accuser or the accused in serious criminal cases. These weren't chivalrous duels between knights. They were often fights to the death between ordinary people who had no training in combat. Women, children, and elderly people could nominate champions to fight for them, but these champions had to swear elaborate oaths that they weren't using magic or supernatural assistance. The battles were conducted in sanctified ground, with priests present to ensure divine judgment was properly rendered. The medieval legal system's treatment of debt created some of the most cruel and unusual punishments in history. Debtors could be imprisoned not just until they paid their debts, but until they had performed sufficient penance for the sin of owing money. Some regions required debtors to walk naked through the town square once per week until their debt was paid. Others mandated that debtors could only eat bread and water and had to sleep on bare ground until they found a way to satisfy their creditors. Perhaps strangest of all were the laws governing blasphemy and heresy. Speaking against the church or expressing doubt about religious doctrine could result in punishments that seemed designed more to satisfy sadistic urges than to promote piety. Blasphemers might have their tongues cut out, but only after being forced to confess their sins while the executioner held the hot blade against their throat. Heretics could be burned alive, but the law specified that they should be kept conscious as long as possible to maximize their suffering and provide an example to others. The legal codes of medieval Europe also included elaborate provisions for dealing with supernatural crimes. Witchcraft, sorcery, and demonic possession were all serious criminal offences, with detailed procedures for investigation and punishment. Suspected witches could be subjected to tests that were essentially death sentences, being thrown into water to see if they would sink or float, having pins stuck into their bodies to find spots that didn't bleed, or being forced to hold red-hot iron to prove their innocence through divine intervention. What makes medieval European law particularly disturbing is how thoroughly it was integrated into daily life. These weren't abstract legal principles that only affected criminals and outcasts. Every aspect of ordinary life was governed by laws that seemed designed to maximize human suffering while maintaining the power of the nobility and the church. The legal system wasn't interested in justice in any sense we would recognize. It was a tool for social control that used fear, pain, and humiliation to keep the population in line. And yet, remarkably, this system persisted for centuries, shaping the development of European civilization and leaving traces that can still be found in modern legal traditions. The strangest laws of medieval Europe remind us that human societies are capable of creating systems of incredible complexity and cruelty, and that the rule of law can be used just as easily to oppress as to protect. The legacy of these bizarre legal traditions extended far beyond the medieval period, influencing the development of law in the emerging nation-states of early modern Europe, and even crossing the Atlantic to shape colonial legal systems in the New World. Understanding these strange and often brutal laws helps us appreciate not just how far legal systems have evolved, but how the fundamental tension between order and justice continues to shape human civilization today. Now, if you thought the laws we've explored so far were bizarre, buckle up, because we're about to dive into some truly mind-bending legal systems that make modern bureaucracy look like a masterpiece of common sense. We're talking about civilizations that created laws so strange, so utterly divorced from what we'd consider rational, that you'll wonder how these societies functioned at all. Let's start with the Aztec Empire, where the legal system was basically a masterclass in creative punishment with a healthy dose of social engineering thrown in. The Aztecs didn't just have laws. They had what can only be described as a legal philosophy, based on the idea that every crime was essentially an offense against the cosmic order itself. Take their approach to theft, for instance. If you stole something worth more than 20 cacao beans, which was roughly the price of a tomato, you didn't just get fined or thrown in jail. No, the Aztecs had a much more permanent solution. You became a slave to the person you robbed. But here's where it gets really weird. If you stole something worth less than 20 cacao beans, you just had to pay it back double. So essentially, the Aztec legal system was saying that petty theft was a minor inconvenience, but anything above tomato-level larceny was a life-altering crime worthy of permanent bondage. But wait, it gets stranger. The Aztecs had what might be the world's first sliding scale of justice, based entirely on social class. If you were a noble caught stealing, the punishment was death. Not slavery, not fines. Straight to the execution platform. The logic was that nobles should know better, and their crimes were therefore more serious because they damaged the moral fabric of society. Meanwhile, commoners got the slavery deal, and slaves who stole were just beaten and told to try harder next time. The Aztecs also had some fascinating ideas about public intoxication. Getting drunk was perfectly legal if you were over 70 years old. The reasoning was that elderly people had earned the right to drink themselves into oblivion as a reward for surviving long enough to become old. But if you were under 70 and got caught drunk in public, you were executed, not fined, not jailed, killed. The Aztecs took their sobriety laws very seriously, except for grandparents who apparently got a free pass to party. They even had laws about hairstyles. Commoners were forbidden from wearing their hair long, while nobles were required to have elaborate hairdos that took hours to maintain. Getting caught with the wrong haircut could result in having your head shaved as a mark of shame or, in extreme cases, being sold into slavery. Imagine explaining to your boss that you're late because you were arrested for having a bad hair day. Now let's hop over to medieval Iceland, which developed what might be the most bizarre legal system in human history. The Icelanders created a society where literally everything could be solved through legal proceedings. And I mean everything. They had laws about how to properly insult someone, regulations on the correct way to challenge someone to a duel, and detailed procedures for what to do if your neighbour's sheep looked at you funny. The Icelandic legal system was based on something called the Althing, which was basically a giant outdoor court session that happened once a year. Everyone in Iceland would gather at this massive legal festival, and they'd spend weeks settling disputes, making new laws, and apparently having the time of their lives doing it. It was like Comic-Con, but for medieval lawyers. But here's the really weird part. Iceland had no police, no prisons, and no standing army. Instead, they had a system called outlawry, where the worst punishment you could receive was being declared an outlaw. This meant that anyone could kill you without consequences, steal your property, or basically treat you however they wanted. You became a non-person in the eyes of the law. It was like being blocked on social media, except the consequences were slightly more fatal. The Icelanders also had incredibly specific laws about everything. They had regulations about how close you could build your house to your neighbour's toilet, rules about what you could and couldn't say about someone's mother, and detailed procedures for what constituted proper revenge. If someone killed your relative, you were legally entitled to kill them back, but only if you followed the correct legal procedures first. You had to announce your intention publicly, give them a chance to pay compensation, and make sure you killed them in an appropriately honourable way. They even had laws about poetry. In Iceland, composing insulting poetry about someone was considered a serious crime, punishable by outlawry. But the insulting poetry had to follow specific metrical patterns and use the correct literary devices, or it didn't count as legally actionable verse, so you could literally be executed for writing bad poetry, but only if it was technically competent bad poetry. Moving on to ancient Babylon, we encounter Hammurabi's Code, which we touched on earlier, but there are some truly bizarre aspects we haven't explored yet. Hammurabi didn't just create an eye for an eye system. He created a legal framework that was obsessed with the idea that every crime created a cosmic imbalance that had to be corrected through precise, often bizarre punishments. For instance, if a son struck his father, the punishment was having his hands cut off, not imprisoned, not fined, hands removed permanently. The logic was that hands that committed violence against a parent were fundamentally corrupted and had to be removed to restore cosmic order. But if a father struck his son, there was no punishment at all, because fathers were considered to have divine authority over their children. The Babylonians also had what might be history's strangest approach to medical malpractice. If a surgeon operated on a nobleman and the patient died, the surgeon's hands were cut off. If the patient was a commoner and died, the surgeon just had to pay a fine. If the patient was a slave and died, the surgeon had to replace the slave. So essentially, the Babylonian medical system created a sliding scale of surgical consequences based on the social status of your patients. But perhaps the weirdest Babylonian law dealt with tavern keepers. If a tavern keeper allowed disorderly conduct in their establishment, they were drowned. Not fined, not closed down. Literally drowned. The Babylonians apparently took their bar atmosphere very seriously. But if a priestess entered a tavern, she was burned alive, because priestesses weren't supposed to be in places where alcohol was served. So tavern keeping in ancient Babylon was essentially a high-stakes hospitality business, where your life depended on your ability to maintain order and check everyone's religious credentials at the door. Let's venture into ancient Persia, where the legal system was built around the concept of cosmic truth versus cosmic lies. The Persians believed that every action was either in service of Ahura Mazda, the god of truth and light, or Ahriman, the god of lies and darkness. This created a legal system where the truth or falsehood of your actions mattered more than their practical consequences. For example, lying was considered one of the worst possible crimes, punishable by death, regardless of the lie's consequences. If you lied about what you had for breakfast, that was legally equivalent to lying about committing murder, because both actions serve the cosmic principle of falsehood. Meanwhile, telling the truth was so highly valued that Persian courts would sometimes acquit criminals if they confessed honestly to their crimes, because honesty was considered more cosmically significant than the actual crime. The Persians also had bizarre laws about debt. If you owed someone money and couldn't pay, you became their slave until you worked off the debt. But here's the twist. If you died while in debt slavery, your children inherited the debt and became slaves to the same person. This could go on for generations, creating hereditary debt slavery that could last centuries. Imagine explaining to your kids that they're going to be slaves because great-great-grandfather borrowed 5 silver pieces and never paid it back. But perhaps the strangest Persian law dealt with the treatment of animals. Killing certain animals, particularly dogs, was considered a serious crime against the cosmic order. Dogs were seen as servants of Ahura Mazda, so killing one was tantamount to attacking the forces of light and truth. The punishment was having to support the dead dog's puppies for the rest of your life, feeding and caring for them as if they were your own children. So animal cruelty in ancient Persia could result in a lifetime of involuntary pet ownership. Now let's explore the legal system of ancient Ethiopia, specifically the kingdom of Aksum, which created what might be the world's most bureaucratic approach to justice. The Aksumites developed a legal system so complex and procedure-heavy that resolving simple disputes could take years. They had a concept called the 40-day rule, where any legal complaint had to be formally announced for 40 consecutive days before it could be heard in court. But it couldn't just be announced anywhere. It had to be proclaimed in the marketplace, at the city gates, and at 3 different religious sites, with witnesses present each time. If you missed even one day, you had to start the whole process over again. The Axumites also had incredibly specific laws about trading. Every transaction had to be witnessed by at least 3 people, recorded by a scribe and blessed by a priest. But the witnesses couldn't be related to either party. The scribe had to be certified by the royal court, and the priest had to be from a different religious order than any of the participants. So buying a loaf of bread could potentially require assembling a committee of 6 people and filling out multiple forms. But the strangest Axumite law dealt with property inheritance. When someone died, their property couldn't be distributed until every single item they owned was catalogued, appraised, and blessed by religious authorities. This process could take months or even years, during which time the deceased's family couldn't touch any of their belongings. There are records of families living in poverty next to their dead relatives' locked house, waiting for bureaucrats to finish counting spoons and blessing furniture. Moving to ancient Japan, we encounter the 17-article constitution created by Prince Shotoku in 604 CE. This wasn't really a constitution in the modern sense, but rather a set of moral and legal guidelines that created one of history's most harmony-obsessed legal systems. The Japanese approach to law was built around the concept of wuei, or social harmony, which meant that any action that disrupted social peace was considered a serious crime, regardless of its actual consequences. Arguing with your superior was punishable by exile, not because the argument caused any real harm, but because disagreement itself was seen as damaging to social harmony. They had laws requiring people to smile in public, not fake smiles or forced happiness, but genuine expressions of contentment. Officials would patrol public spaces looking for people who seemed unhappy or disgruntled, and chronic frowners could be fined or forced to undergo re-education to learn proper emotional regulation. Imagine getting a ticket for having a bad day. The Japanese also developed incredibly specific laws about gift giving. Every gift had to be appropriate to the recipient's social status, wrapped in the correct manner, and presented with the proper ceremonial language. Giving someone a gift that was too expensive for their social rank was considered insulting, while giving a gift that was too cheap was also insulting. There were official gift-giving manuals that people had to study to avoid accidentally committing social crimes. But perhaps the strangest Japanese law dealt with seasonal behavior. There were different legal expectations for how people should act during different times of the year. In spring, people were expected to be optimistic and energetic. In summer, they should be productive and focused. In autumn, they should be contemplative and grateful. In winter, they should be quiet and introspective. Acting out of season, being too cheerful in winter or too melancholy in spring, could result in social sanctions or even legal punishment. Let's conclude this journey through legal insanity with ancient Carthage, which developed what might be the most economically driven legal system in history. The Carthaginians were merchants first and everything else second, so their laws were entirely focused on protecting and promoting trade. They had laws that made it illegal to retire from business before the age of 60, because early retirement was seen as damaging to the economy. If you tried to stop working before 60, your property could be confiscated and redistributed to more productive citizens. So essentially, ancient Carthage had legally mandated workaholism. The Carthaginians also had bizarre laws about luxury goods. Wearing clothes that were too expensive was illegal, not because of moral concerns, but because it represented inefficient allocation of capital. The money spent on fancy clothes should have been invested in trading ventures instead. Similarly, eating expensive food was regulated by law, with detailed guidelines about how much you could spend on meals based on your income level. But the strangest Carthaginian law dealt with family planning. Having too many children was considered economically irresponsible and was punishable by fines because large families consumed resources that could be used for business investment. Having too few children was also illegal because it meant you weren't producing enough future workers and traders. So Carthaginian families had to hit a specific sweet spot of fertility to avoid legal consequences. As we wrap up this exploration of ancient legal madness, it's important to remember that these weren't just arbitrary rules created by crazy rulers. These legal systems reflected the deepest values, fears, and obsessions of their respective societies. The Aztecs were obsessed with cosmic order, the Icelanders with honor and procedure, the Babylonians with social hierarchy, the Persians with truth and lies, the Ethiopians with bureaucratic perfection, the Japanese with social harmony, and the Carthaginians with economic efficiency. Each of these legal systems was, in its own way, a complete worldview translated into law. They show us how profoundly different human societies can be, and how the things we take for granted, like the presumption of innocence, proportional punishment, or equal treatment under law, are actually relatively recent innovations in human history. These ancient legal codes remind us that law isn't just about maintaining order or protecting rights. It's about expressing what a society values most deeply, what it fears most intensely, and what it believes about the fundamental nature of human existence. And sometimes, those beliefs can produce legal systems so strange that they make our modern world look almost boringly rational by comparison. But if you thought the supernatural terrors and witchcraft accusations were the darkest depths of medieval romantic life, you haven't yet encountered the most insidious enemy of all, the one that lurked not in shadows or accusations, but in the very fabric of daily existence itself: death. Not the dramatic, heroic death of knights in battle or the martyrdom of saints, but the quiet, relentless, ever-present spectre of mortality that made every romantic attachment a race against time, every tender moment a potential final goodbye. Medieval life was, quite simply, brutally short. When we talk about the average lifespan hovering around 30 to 40 years, we're not discussing some abstract statistic. We're talking about young lovers who knew with mathematical certainty that their time together was measured not in decades, but in precious, fleeting years. Imagine trying to build a romantic relationship when you both understood that one of you would very likely be dead before your 10th wedding anniversary. The numbers tell a story that would horrify any modern couple. In medieval England, it's estimated that nearly half of all children died before reaching their 5th birthday. Of those who survived to adulthood, many would be dead by 25, and to live past 40 was considered a remarkable achievement. This wasn't some distant threat or abstract possibility. This was the lived reality that shaped every romantic decision, every marriage negotiation, every whispered promise between lovers. Consider the case of Eleanor de Montfort, a minor noblewoman whose diary fragments survived the centuries. Married at 14 to a man of 28, Eleanor bore her first child at 15. By the time she was 22, she had given birth 6 times and buried 4 children. Her husband died of fever when she was 26, leaving her a widow with 2 surviving children, and the grim knowledge that she had perhaps 10 years left to live, if she was fortunate. Her diary entries from this period are heartbreaking in their resigned acceptance. I pray daily that God grants me time enough to see my remaining babes reach their majority, for I know not what tomorrow may bring. But Eleanor's story, tragic as it was, represents the experience of the privileged classes. For peasants and the urban poor, mortality was even more savage and unpredictable. Malnutrition weakened immune systems, making people vulnerable to diseases that would barely inconvenience a well-fed noble. Hard physical labor wore out bodies decades before their time. Workplace accidents were common and almost always fatal: a slip while thatching a roof, a kick from a horse, a cut that turned septic could end a life in days. The constant presence of death created a peculiar intensity to medieval romance that modern people can barely comprehend. When you knew that your beloved might be taken by plague, accident, or childbirth at any moment, every day together became precious beyond measure. Love letters from the period are suffused with an urgency and desperation that reflects this reality. A merchant's correspondence with his wife from the 14th century includes the line, "Each morning I wake believing this may be our last together, and each evening I thank God for granting us another day of grace." This awareness of mortality infused medieval courtship with both desperate passion and practical calculation. Young people couldn't afford the luxury of extended courtship periods or gradual emotional development. When life was this short, romantic decisions had to be made quickly, relationships had to develop rapidly, and couples had to accept that their time together might be measured in months rather than years. The seasonal rhythms of death added another layer of terror to medieval romantic life. Winter was particularly deadly, claiming the weak, the old, and the unlucky with ruthless efficiency. Couples would often marry in spring or summer, hoping to conceive and bear children before the deadly cold months arrived. But even this practical timing couldn't protect against the randomness of medieval mortality. A healthy young woman could be dead of fever within a week. A strong young man could succumb to injury or disease with shocking suddenness. Pregnancy and childbirth, which should have been the joyful culmination of romantic love, instead became a form of Russian roulette that claimed countless young mothers. Medieval medical understanding of pregnancy was primitive at best and actively harmful at worst. Physicians believed that women's bodies were fundamentally flawed versions of men's bodies, cold and wet, rather than hot and dry. And this misunderstanding led to treatments that often did more harm than good. Bloodletting was prescribed for pregnant women to balance their humours. Herbal remedies often contained substances that were toxic to developing fetuses, and the complete absence of sterile birthing practices meant that infection was a constant threat. The statistics on maternal mortality are staggering. In some regions and time periods, it's estimated that between 20 and 40% of women died in childbirth or from related complications. For young couples planning their future together, every pregnancy was literally a life or death gamble. Imagine the psychological toll of this reality, the joy of conception immediately shadowed by the knowledge that this pregnancy might orphan your existing children and leave your husband a widower. Men faced their own particular mortality risks that shaped romantic relationships in devastating ways. Warfare was a constant threat, but not just for professional soldiers. Peasant men could be conscripted at any time to serve in their lord's military campaigns, torn away from their families and sent to fight in distant lands from which they might never return. Even those who survived battle faced the journey home through hostile territory, often without adequate food or medical care. The feudal system created additional mortality risks that hung over every romantic relationship, like a sword of Damocles. A lord's displeasure could result in exile, imprisonment, or execution. Political changes could overnight transform a prosperous merchant into a penniless refugee. Religious accusations could lead to burning at the stake. Young couples planning their lives together had to contend not just with natural mortality, but with the constant threat of violent death from human causes. Disease, of course, was the great equalizer that respected neither rank nor youth nor love. The Black Death was only the most famous of the plagues that periodically swept through medieval Europe. But it was far from the only one. Smallpox, typhoid, dysentery, tuberculosis, and countless other ailments moved through communities like wildfire, claiming victims seemingly at random. A couple might go to sleep healthy and wake to find one partner burning with fever. Within days, love could turn to grief, partnership to solitude. The psychological impact of living under such constant threat of loss cannot be overstated. Medieval people developed coping mechanisms that would seem strange to modern eyes. Some threw themselves into religious devotion, viewing their earthly relationships as temporary arrangements that would be perfected in the afterlife. Others became almost fatalistic, accepting loss as inevitable and trying not to become too emotionally attached to anyone. Still others embraced a kind of desperate hedonism, believing that since time was short, pleasure should be seized whenever possible. These different approaches to mortality created tensions within romantic relationships that had no easy resolution. A deeply religious spouse might view excessive grief over a child's death as evidence of insufficient faith in God's plan, while a more secular partner might interpret religious resignation as callous indifference. Couples had to navigate not just their own mortality, but their different ways of understanding and coping with the constant presence of death. The medieval church's teachings about death and the afterlife added another complex layer to romantic relationships shaped by mortality. Marriage was considered a sacrament, blessed by God, but it was also explicitly temporary, until death do us part. The church taught that truly holy people should view earthly attachments, even marriage, as secondary to their relationship with God. This created an impossible tension for couples who loved each other deeply, but were told that excessive earthly love could endanger their souls. Widowhood was an almost inevitable part of medieval life, and the social structures around it reveal much about how mortality shaped romantic relationships. Widows, particularly young ones, were seen as both vulnerable and dangerous. They had experienced sexual intimacy, but were no longer under direct male control, making them objects of suspicion and desire. Society pressured widows to remarry quickly, partly for their own protection, but also to restore proper social order. Yet many widows, having experienced the pain of loss, were reluctant to risk their hearts again. The death of children was so common that medieval parents often delayed naming infants for weeks or months, waiting to see if they would survive. This practice reflects a heartbreaking attempt to protect themselves emotionally from the grief that was statistically likely to follow. Yet the very frequency of infant and child mortality also meant that couples who lost children could find support and understanding from their communities in ways that might seem surprising today. Grief was shared, normalized, and integrated into the rhythms of communal life. For those fortunate enough to survive into what medieval people considered old age, perhaps 50 or 60 years, the accumulated losses could be staggering. An elderly person might have buried multiple spouses, most of their children, and countless friends and relatives. Yet these survivors often became repositories of wisdom about love and loss, offering guidance to younger couples about how to navigate the emotional landscape of a world where death was always present. The artifacts that survive from medieval romantic life bear witness to this constant awareness of mortality. Love tokens were often crafted from materials believed to offer protection against death. Silver, certain stones, herbs, with supposed medicinal properties. Wedding rings frequently bore inscriptions not just of love, but of prayers for protection and long life. Even love poetry from the period is suffused with awareness of time's passage and the certainty of eventual separation. Understanding this context helps explain some of the seemingly harsh or practical aspects of medieval romance that modern people find unfeeling. When death could strike at any moment, romantic relationships had to serve multiple functions. Emotional fulfillment, yes, but also economic survival, social protection, and the practical necessities of daily life. Love was a luxury that had to be balanced against the brutal realities of mortality and survival. Yet perhaps most remarkably, love persisted and even flourished under these impossible conditions. Medieval people found ways to create meaning, beauty, and connection, despite, or perhaps because of, the constant presence of death. Their love letters speak of cherishing each moment together. Their artwork celebrates the preciousness of human connection, and their stories preserve the memory of couples who chose to love deeply, despite knowing that loss was inevitable. The medieval understanding of romantic love was shaped fundamentally by the knowledge that it was temporary. This wasn't seen as a flaw or tragedy, but as a basic condition of earthly existence. Love was precious precisely because it was fragile, meaningful because it was brief, worth fighting for because it could be lost at any moment. As we continue our exploration of medieval romantic life, we'll see how this ever-present awareness of mortality influenced everything from courtship customs to marriage ceremonies to the development of literary traditions that celebrated love even as they acknowledged its inevitable end. The medieval approach to romance cannot be understood without recognizing that it was, fundamentally, an act of courage. The decision to open one's heart fully, while knowing that heartbreak was not just possible, but statistically probable. In our modern world, where medical advances have pushed death back to the margins of daily life, it's easy to forget how recently human existence was defined by such brutal uncertainty. The medieval lovers, who chose to build lives together despite knowing how quickly those lives could be shattered, represent a kind of bravery that deserves our recognition and respect. They loved not because it was safe, but because it was human, and in doing so, they created something beautiful and enduring even in the face of mortality's relentless march. The strange laws of ancient times weren't just arbitrary rules etched in stone or whispered through palace corridors. They were the DNA of civilization itself, encoding the deepest fears, hopes, and contradictions of entire societies. As we've journeyed through the brutal codes of Babylon, the mystical justice of ancient Egypt, the hierarchical order of China, and the complex caste system of India, we've seen how law has always been more than mere regulation. It has been humanity's attempt to wrestle meaning from chaos, to impose order on the fundamental uncertainty of existence. But perhaps what's most fascinating about these ancient legal systems is how they reveal the eternal human struggle between power and justice, between the ideal and the practical, between what we aspire to be and what we actually are. Every law we've examined tells a story not just about crime and punishment, but about who mattered in society and who didn't, about what was considered sacred and what was disposable, about the price of stepping outside the accepted order. Consider how these ancient codes approach the concept of individual worth. In Hammurabi's Babylon, your life's value was literally written in stone, calculated according to your social position. A nobleman's eye was worth more than a commoner's life. This wasn't seen as injustice, but as cosmic order, a reflection of natural hierarchy that extended from the earthly realm to the divine. The gods themselves, according to Babylonian belief, had established these distinctions, and to challenge them was to challenge the very structure of reality. Yet even within these rigid hierarchies, we find glimmers of something approaching what we might recognize as human rights. The Code of Hammurabi, for all its harsh punishments and class distinctions, contained protections for widows and orphans, regulations to prevent the exploitation of debtors, and provisions for what we might now call due process. These weren't born from modern notions of equality, but from a practical understanding that societies needed mechanisms to prevent the powerful from completely crushing the powerless. In ancient Egypt, the concept of ma'at represented something even more profound than law. It was the cosmic principle of truth, justice, and order that governed not just human behavior, but the movement of the stars. the flooding of the Nile, and the journey of souls through the afterlife. Egyptian law wasn't just about maintaining social order. It was about keeping the universe itself in balance. When a pharaoh dispensed justice, he was acting as the earthly representative of divine order, ensuring that human society remained aligned with cosmic truth. This connection between law and cosmic order appears again and again in ancient societies. In China, the mandate of heaven provided the ultimate justification for imperial authority, but it also imposed limitations on that power. An unjust ruler could lose the mandate, could literally forfeit the right to rule if his actions threw the world out of balance. Natural disasters, famines, and rebellions were all seen as signs that the cosmic order had been disrupted, that the law had failed in its fundamental purpose of maintaining harmony between heaven and earth. The Indian caste system, perhaps the most rigid social hierarchy in human history, was similarly justified through cosmic principles. Dharma, the righteous duty assigned to each person according to their station in life, wasn't seen as oppressive, but as liberating. By fulfilling one's dharma, by accepting the role assigned by birth and cosmic design, an individual contributed to the maintenance of universal order and advanced their own spiritual development. The law didn't just govern this life, it shaped the soul's journey through countless future lives or in the afterlife. What emerges from these ancient systems is a picture of law as something far more ambitious than our modern understanding suggests. These weren't just rules for preventing theft or resolving disputes. They were comprehensive worldviews, complete systems for understanding humanity's place in the cosmos. They addressed not just how people should behave, but why they should behave that way, what the consequences of their actions would be, not just in this life, but in future lives or in the afterlife, and how individual conduct connected to the welfare of society, the natural world, and the divine realm. This cosmic dimension of ancient law helps explain why these systems could be simultaneously sophisticated and brutal, protective and oppressive, wise and utterly alien to modern sensibilities. They weren't designed primarily to protect individual rights or promote personal freedom. They were designed to maintain order in societies that understood themselves to be part of a larger, more fragile cosmic system that could be disrupted by human misconduct. The punishments these systems prescribed often seem shockingly harsh to modern eyes, but they made sense within their cosmic framework. If a single act of adultery could anger the gods and bring drought to an entire kingdom, then execution might seem not just justified, but necessary for the survival of the community. If lying in court could disrupt the cosmic principle of truth and throw the universe out of balance, then cutting out the liar's tongue might be seen as a small price to pay for maintaining universal order. Yet even as we recognize the internal logic of these systems, we can't ignore their human cost. The ancient legal codes we've examined were built on the suffering of countless individuals whose lives were sacrificed to abstract principles of order and hierarchy. Women who were stoned for adultery while their male partners went unpunished, slaves who were branded or mutilated for minor infractions, commoners who were executed for crimes that would earn nobles a simple fine, children who were sold into slavery to pay their parents' debts. All of these were the human price of cosmic order. Perhaps what's most unsettling about studying these ancient laws is recognizing how many of their underlying assumptions persist in modified forms today. The idea that some lives are worth more than others, that social position should determine legal consequences, that maintaining order is more important than protecting individual rights, that the law should reflect and enforce existing power structures rather than challenge them. These notions didn't disappear with the fall of ancient empires. They evolved, adapted, found new forms of expression in each successive age, The Roman legal system, which built upon many of the principles we've examined, became the foundation for legal systems across Europe and eventually much of the world. The notion of legal precedent, the distinction between civil and criminal law, the concept of legal persons and legal rights, all of these trace their origins back to Roman adaptations of even older legal traditions. But Roman law also preserved and systematized many of the hierarchical assumptions of earlier systems, creating a legal framework that protected the rights of citizens, while denying basic protections to slaves and foreigners. Medieval European law, deeply influenced by both Roman precedent and Christian theology, created new justifications for old inequalities. The divine right of kings replaced the mandate of heaven, but served the same function of placing political authority beyond human challenge. Canon law governed matters of marriage, sexuality, and spiritual life, with a thoroughness that would have impressed the priests of ancient Egypt. The feudal system created new forms of legal bondage that echoed the slavery of ancient times, while clothing them in the language of mutual obligation and Christian duty. Even as we moved into the modern era, as concepts of individual rights and human dignity began to challenge ancient hierarchies, the legacy of these early legal systems remained powerful. The American Constitution, for all its revolutionary language about equality and justice, initially extended full legal protection only to white male property owners. Women, slaves, and indigenous peoples were excluded from the promise of equal justice under law, their exclusion justified by arguments that would have been familiar to the lawmakers of ancient Babylon or the Brahmin scholars of classical India. The struggle for civil rights, women's rights, workers' rights, and human rights more broadly can be understood as an ongoing effort to purge our legal systems of their ancient hierarchical assumptions, to create forms of law that protect individuals rather than abstract principles of order, that serve human dignity rather than cosmic hierarchy. But this struggle is far from complete, and the ancient impulses toward legal inequality and systematic oppression continue to find new expressions in each generation. Understanding these ancient legal systems helps us recognize that our modern concepts of justice and human rights are not natural or inevitable developments, but hard-won achievements that represent a fundamental break with thousands of years of legal tradition. The idea that all people, regardless of birth or social position, deserve equal protection under the law would have been incomprehensible to the lawmakers of ancient times. They would have seen it not as progress, but as dangerous chaos, a rejection of the cosmic order that law was meant to preserve. Yet even as we celebrate how far we've come, studying these ancient systems reminds us how fragile our achievements really are. The human impulses toward hierarchy, exclusion, and the use of law to protect existing power structures didn't disappear with the advent of modern legal systems. They merely went underground, finding new ways to express themselves within frameworks that officially embrace equality and justice. The strange laws of ancient times weren't aberrations or primitive mistakes. They were sophisticated responses to the fundamental challenge of creating order in human societies. They failed ultimately because they prioritized abstract principles over human dignity, because they treated people as means rather than ends, because they confused the maintenance of existing power structures with the pursuit of justice. But their failure teaches us something crucial about the ongoing project of creating just societies. That law alone is not enough, that formal equality is meaningless without substantive protection, and that the price of justice is eternal vigilance against the ancient human tendency to create hierarchies and enforce them through violence. As we continue to grapple with questions of justice and equality in our own time, the voices of those who suffered under these ancient systems call out to us across the centuries. They remind us that every legal system is a choice, that the way we structure our laws reflects our deepest values and assumptions about human worth and social order. They challenge us to examine our own legal traditions with the same critical eye we've turned on theirs, to ask whether our systems truly serve justice or merely provide more sophisticated ways of protecting existing inequalities. The strange laws of ancient times were, in the end, not so different from our own. They were human creations, reflecting human fears and desires and prejudices. They were attempts to solve the eternal problem of how to live together in societies without destroying each other. They failed in ways that cost countless lives and caused immeasurable suffering. But they also laid the groundwork for everything that came after. Understanding them helps us understand ourselves, and perhaps, if we're very careful and very lucky, helps us do better. The thread that connects Hammurabi's code to our modern legal systems is unbroken, woven through thousands of years of human struggle to create order from chaos, justice from power, hope from suffering. As we've seen, that thread is stained with blood and tears, marked by exclusion and oppression, but it also carries within it the seeds of something better. The slowly growing recognition that law should serve humanity rather than the other way around, that justice should protect the vulnerable rather than the powerful, and that the strange laws we create today will someday be judged by standards we can barely imagine. In the end, perhaps that's the most important lesson these ancient legal systems can teach us, that the work of justice is never finished, that each generation must choose anew what kind of society it wants to create, and that the laws we make today will echo through the centuries, shaping the lives of people not yet born. The strange laws of ancient times remind us that we are not the end of history, but merely another chapter in humanity's long and often troubled attempt to learn how to live together with dignity, compassion, and justice for all. From divine punishments to hereditary crimes, ancient laws reveal humanity's enduring drive to impose order, however unconventional the methods. While some of these rules now seem absurd, they underscore that our modern conception of fair and equal justice is a relatively recent development,